Okay. Hey, everybody. Um, I'm just gonna touch on something that's kind of like keeping with the last video, just kind of like some labels and semantics that irk me and what I think is kind of more applicable and beneficial for my life. And specifically what I'm thinking about is when I was really still in the hospital, like recovering from the murder suicide and being almost killed. That was really, like I said in previous videos, the start of my recovery. um I knew I had to get sober, and I knew I had to go deeper than just being able to like pass a urinalysis test. I had to get to the root of my addiction, which was what led me to drugs and to drug use, drug abuse, and subsequently addiction in the first place. People that can live with themselves don't feel the need, to escape themselves constantly. And so I really had to get to the root of what led me there. And when I started looking into like some of the big names in recovery, there's kind of like these two different schools of thought about, is addiction a disease, or Augustine Burroughs is like, oh, some people get mad at me when I say relapse is not part of recovery. And maybe for him, I guess that's true. And I never understood that either, because I never recovered. So I never had, like, every time I relapsed, it was just like, oh, okay. It was just part of like using. But that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. The disease of addiction. Is it a disease or not? And is relapse part of recovery from my perspective? And it is a disease, first off, with addiction. It doesn't fucking matter. That's really the bottom line. It doesn't matter if it's like technically a disease or a disorder or how it's labeled. In my opinion, like, the result is the same, the problem is the same, and what you're going to have to do, what's it matter what's it labeled on paper? It doesn't matter. I think it is a disease, but you know what did that have to do with anything? So that's kind of, irrelevant. And I think people sometimes get too hung up on like the semantics of it. And addiction, as being part of recovery, absolutely, or relapse is part of recovery. Um, and I did not know that until I really recovered. When I started my journey to recovery in the hospital, which is going on 5 years ago, next month. It was like a process of about 6 total months before I truly got sober, and stayed sober. Within the 6 month period it took for me to get sober, I had like multiple relapses. And the truth is that, um, I was in the hospital for a month recovering from being almost murdered. And in that time frame, I got high a few times just from like people that I met in the hospital. um and I could only use two fingers, my index and my middle finger on my left hand, and I was still able to acquire heroin and get high in the hospital. It was like, honestly, really sad and pretty pathetic. But what had changed was that it wasn't just, I knew I was going to have to get sober. I knew I wanted to get sober. I knew I had to make these major changes or I was going to die. And I knew for the first time in my life that I did not want to die, and I did not want to die without knowing that I had tried to live. But there I was, relapsing within a couple weeks, like 2 weeks of having this like epiphany. So recovery, the bottom line that I've found is that recovery is not like a singular event. It is not like a one day event. It is not a singular thing. And it's kind of, recovery is like rock bottom. There was no like single event that was rock bottom for me. Like, my life was rock bottom. And in like the recovery and addiction recovery community, you'll notice I found a lot of people seem to have those rock bottom stories, and my life was rock bottom. I lived in rock bottom, and I loved it. You know, it wasn't like, oh God, that was my wake up call. You know, I was almost murdered, and that did start, like I said, the road to my recovery, but it was really going into fight or flight mode, and realizing that my soul wanted to live, even though my ego has been denying that fact for like 34 years. Um, but yeah, it wasn't like, oh, well, that was it. That was my wake up call, you know? Um, but I forgot where I was going with that. Like, I'm kind of all over the place today. But yeah, like recovery is a process, and rock bottom, you know, you don't wait on like a rock bottom, because it might never come if you're anything like me. And a past like drug screen is not indicative of sobriety, you know. it, Sobriety is like, you will pass drug screens and you will have like a clean urinalysis. You will be able to like pass the piss test when you are sober. But just because you can pee in a cup and pass a drug screen does not mean that you are sober, you know. And that's kind of like the big catch with rehabs and like detoxes, is they'll help get the drugs flushed out of your system. But having drugs flushed out of your system is not like, you know, that if that equaled sobriety, then like rehabs and jails and even detoxes would work. You know, anybody can be thrown in a room or detox in a safe way under like medical supervision and then pass a drug screen in a couple weeks to a month. But the sobriety, you know, has to come from the inside out, and a clean urinalysis and having, you know, no drugs in your system will be a result of your sobriety, but it won't be the other way around necessarily. And when I would relapse, like within the first 6 months of my road to recovery, and of really getting, you know, that the half a year that it took for me to fully get sober, when I would relapse, I knew that my mindset was different, you know, and that was the big thing. That's why relapse is part of recovery. And I did not know that until I was really ready to recover, because just because I had all messed up and had, you know, gotten high, I wasn't willing to like throw in the towel when I knew I was still like the same person who was not just going to say, oh, well, fuck it, you know. So I do think, you know, relapse is a part of recovery when you are ready to recover. Um, Addiction is a disease, and anxiety too. That's another one. People get hung up on the semantics a lot of like, is it a disease? Is it a disorder? You know, Joe Rogan went on this. He was talking to I forget who he was interviewing on his podcast a while back, and he was talking about anxiety, you know, not really being like technically a disorder or disease or whatever. And it's frustrating when people who don't really, you know, have these issues talk about them like they know what they're talking about, because anxiety monopolized my life like nothing else. You know, anxiety was like the killer for me. And a big part of the reason that I used drugs and used to excess to begin with was to really like cure this debilitating feeling of disease within myself. You know, I was so uncomfortable in every aspect of like cognizant life that I felt the need to like escape myself as much as possible and get as far enough away from myself as possible, you know. And that was anxiety, like this frenzy of just discomfort within myself and my head and my body and every aspect of reality. And so, you know, when you have a hard time like standing up for yourself or speaking your truth or fucking paying a bill, talking on the phone, using the bathroom in public, like everything gives you anxiety. For me, the biggest, one of the biggest things was getting to the root cause of trying to just look inside myself and be like, okay, maybe there was actually something to feeling cursed. Maybe that wasn't just, just like a phrase I use. Like I always felt cursed. And maybe that's what like generational trauma and everything that we inherent like from our parents and our bloodlines and the family that we're born into. Everybody has issues and has like weird family dynamics and stuff like that. And in my family, I had an amazing family, but that didn't mean that I felt like supported with just like using my voice and speaking up for myself and being myself. And it's taken me like years to say, that's okay to say, that was my experience. It doesn't mean, that I was wrong or that I'm bad for saying that because I had a good family. There's still going to be things that we like inherit from our parents and from our family, that we have to process, and it's up to us to process, to break those curses. And the thing about a curse is like right on the other side, it's like a coin, on one side it's a curse, on the other side it's like the biggest, the biggest blessing and gift. And coming out on the other side of like just this like inability to live with myself, in the past, like going on 5 years that I've been sober, it has been the only time in my life like I've really loved myself and I've really loved life. And I wouldn't have this level of appreciation and gratitude if I hadn't like gone through everything I went through my 20s and in my 30s and even well before I ever did drugs. So it's just been a huge thing. And if you can just pinpoint the root of like your frenzy, or even sometimes when you can't get to it, it's like, okay, it is something. It's either going to be nature or nurture or some combination. And then it's like, well, okay, what are you going to do about it? Like you just have to say, well, it's both of those things or it's one of those things, and then try to process through it and just, like Mel Robbins said, like I said the other day, just do it anyway. Do something to express yourself or to move your body or to like write it out or start journaling. There's like a million things you can do to help you like work through the pain of living. But I'm just going to cut it off there. I really didn't have time to like make a video, but I just kind of wanted to get that off of my mind because I don't know. Sometimes you watch things, it's just like frustrating to see people who are like highly successful be like, well, actually that's not even like a disorder or a disease. And it's like, it's easy for you to fucking say, but anyway, you guys have a good night.